My name is Dean Wesley Smith, and welcome to the lecture on pen names. I probably know more about pen names than almost anybody else, maybe even in the history of writing. I have written under more pen names and stories, novels, you name it, than I can count. We tried before this workshop, and I tried about a year ago to go back and actually do some sort of attempt to count the number of names I have written under. I have ghosted novels under. I have my own, I had a thriller series, I have a mystery series, I've written books with my wife, I have collaborated with scientists and movie stars, and it's just ridiculous. I don't know how I ended up doing this. Basically, I think it's something. It's because of something I'll talk about towards the end of this series of lectures. But you know, I am unbelievable number of pen names, and the reasons for pen names have changed. I'll talk about that as this goes on. The reasons to do a pen name have now changed, and to not do pen names have now changed. So, you know, and we'll talk about all the decision things you need to look at and everything else. I'll go cover all of that sort of stuff as this goes on. So, again, I am Dean Wesley Smith. I hope you would know that by getting a lot of this probably on my blog site, and I'll be the one that will be setting up the mailing to get the passwords to you every month on this. You can come back to this as often as you want. If you get confused on something or any of these lectures that you've signed up for, you can come back at any point and look them over again. And if you don't happen to have the current month's password, just write me and I'll get it to you. The aspect of why we're doing pen names is because on my blog I get unbelievable amounts of questions about pen names. It seems to be an ongoing, and I've done a couple blogs about it, but a blog is difficult to cover everything about a pen name and cover it in depth and cover it in a way that people will understand. And so that's why Chris and I decided that I needed to do this lecture as well and add it into the group of lectures that we have done. And so it's one of those things. The first thing I want to do in this very first segment is to talk a little bit about the history of pen names. Pen names are they've been around forever, for a long time, for all sorts of various reasons that they've been around. But they came into prominence more than anything else in the period in the middle 1800s, when people, a lot of writers were writing in what's called the penny dreadfuls, the dime novels, that sort of stuff. There were just a ton of writers working in that. Almost all of it was under pen name, and so that became the initial start of that back in the middle 1800s, right after the Civil War, during the Civil War, a little bit pre-Civil War, in that period of time. And of course, we all know some of the more famous pen names from the 1800s, early 1900s, people like Mark Twain. It's a pen name. So the truth of the matter is that you would be stunned as to some of your favorite writers' pen names and what they are and how long they've lasted and everything else. The most fun story I have about pen names is I was walking into it was a mall store about 20 years ago, 15 years ago, and there were two customers arguing at one of the big tables up front where they had a lot of books, and they were arguing over the merits of Barbara Michaels and Elizabeth Peters, and how one of them was such a better writer than the other. One of these two, there were two women, and they were making some pretty good arguments about why Barbara Michaels was a better writer than Elizabeth Peters was, and then the other one was Elizabeth Peters is so much better than Barbara Michaels, and they were going back and forth about this. And I stood there and listened for a little bit, pretending to a book, and then finally I just couldn't handle it anymore and had to walk away, because Barbara Michaels, the New York Times bestselling writer, and Elizabeth Peters, the New York Times bestselling writer, are both a woman by the name of Barbara Mertz. And so those are both two of her pen names, two of her numbers of pen names, but those are two of her most famous pen names. And so that's it was just funny to hear these two people argue about the quality of the writing from the same writer, and so it was great fun to hear that. I think these two women would have been appalled to understand that Barbara Mertz was Elizabeth Peters and Barbara Michaels, and so that's the kind of thing that pen names can get you into. Um, the Going back into some history here, the next real insurgence of pen names was, of course, the pulp era, from basically the turn of the 19th century up until, well, it sort of continued until about 1958 with the collapse of the distribution system and what killed the last of the pulps and a lot of the digests and all kinds of other magazines. But for that almost 60 years, or probably more than like 70 years in there, because it started back with Muncie and All Story back in the 1890s. There were a lot of writers writing a lot of different stuff, and many of them were really wanted to produce a lot. One of the main reasons for pen names back there is they already had a story in that issue, and so the editor would have them write another story. Um, it turned out that some of the pulp writers could be writing under 7, 8, 9 names at any given point. There were a few of them that only made it through their entire careers with 2 or 3 names, but almost every pulp writer had a number of names. And that is the aspect of the pulps. Pulps are big, the bigger size magazines on cheap pulp paper, usually garish covers. There were every genre imaginable. There were hundreds and hundreds of pulps put out every month with different titles, from air war stories to all romance stories to whatever. Most novels that were not published in the literary book form, in a hardback at that point. There were no paperbacks up until 1938, 39, and they didn't even get popular until after the war. So, most novels were published in pulps. Novels in that period of time were 25 to 40,000 words. They didn't tend to be much longer in the pulp era. And that page count also stayed clear up into the 70s. So one of the aspects about pen names there on the history at that point is also there were a lot of these publishers started deciding that they could just hire writers, and so they invented names, and they became house names. Kenneth Roberson is a prime example of a house name, and he mostly was written by a writer by the name of Lester Dent, who had many, many, many pen names. But Kenneth Roberson, for the Doc Savage series, he was writing a novel a month for the Doc Savage magazines and other things like that. Lots and lots of the young adult, all the Nancy Drews and the Hardy Boys and all that, were put out by a factory. Basically, there was a fiction factory, and they were all written under pen names. The company owned the books. The authors were hired workers, and so that's the nature of that. What happened up into the digest era is that there were so few writers that were producing in some of the genres that they often would produce 5 and 6 stories in an issue. I was down at Harlan's place one day, and I asked him if I could bring down one of the men's magazines from out of the late 60s, early 70s, late 60s, that I had found with one of his stories in it. And I asked him if I could bring it down next time I was down and if he'd sign it. And he said, "Oh, sure. And I'll sign the other story that's in there, and I'll sign this column, and I'll sign that column." Turned out he'd written 3 columns under 3 different names and 2 of the short stories, the only one of which was under the Harlan Ellison name. So, then there's the softcore porn of the 60s, and so where Bob Silverberg and Marion Zimmer Bradley and Lawrence Block and on and on and on, they wrote hundreds and hundreds of these softcore porns. And they were, very light compared to modern times. I mean, romances now have more sex in them than these softcore porns did, but they were doing them under pen names. And so, it's an entire hobby, and I have a lot of them. And trying to find, which one Lawrence Block wrote, which one Robert Silverberg wrote, which one Harlan Ellison wrote, which ones Marion Zimmer Bradley wrote, and just on and on. The names that wrote these were, Evan Hunter. Of course, Evan Hunter is a pen name. He won the Pulitzer Prize for The Blackboard Jungle, and he had a lot of pen names. His original name, he turned out to actually get his name completely legally changed to Evan Hunter somewhere in the 50s. but he was writing under pen names everywhere. But Evan Hunter won the Pulitzer Prize, but he wanted to write other stuff. So he also wanted to write some things. So he invented a brand new genre, which is the police procedural genre, under the name Ed McBain. So yes, Ed McBain is a pen name. So again, this is a standard part of publishing. Pen names have been around forever and for lots and lots of reasons. The more you dig into some of your favorite writers, the more you'll realize that, oh my, that was just a pen name. Oh my, that was just a pen name of so and so and so and so. It is great fun to go back and look at the history. So, but that's all I want to do is just give you a little awareness of how prevalent pen names. There's nothing new, nothing created here that's new under the sun. But each writer needs to make the decision, and that's what hopefully this lecture series will help you do. Okay, on to the next video.